So here we are on the draw with an okay hand. I think we're going to keep it. It's got one Infect threat, and we'll see what we want to do with this Gitaxian Probe. Now that we see Cinderglade, we know we're probably up against a green-red Valakut deck, or Scapeshift deck, I should say, but we'll fire off this Gitaxian Probe anyways and see if that is indeed the case. And the reason why I don't like paying the mana is, first of all, we would have to find Breeding Pool anyways with our Heath, and second of all, we might draw a 1-mana card we want to play. So it does look like that is the case. It's the green-red Scapeshift deck. So we see Scapeshift, Courser, Valakut, and 3 other mountains, essentially. So, okay. And we just drew another one, so we're just going to fire it off again for the same reasons we didn't want to pay mana the first time. We're not going to do it the second time. And unfortunately, we've drawn double Pendelhaven here, which is far from what we wanted, but that's okay. So I think we just play Windswept Heath and pass. Next turn, we're going to be able to play our Inkmoth Nexus. We do have 2 pump spells, so we're not that far away from being able to kill our opponent, but this Explore was actually quite a good draw from our opponent, as it's going to speed up their clock. And all our opponent's basically trying to do is get to 7 lands and then cast the Scapeshift. And at that point, the game is going to be over in our opponent's favor, so we're basically racing against that happening. And here's another Gitaxian Probe. We're probably just going to play this Blighted Agent no matter what, so I'm actually fine with just holding the Probe until next turn. And that way we'll have a better idea if we're up against something like a Primeval Titan as well. But we're also just hoping to be able to win next turn. We've got Pendelhaven plus mutagenic, double mutagenic growth, so that represents a total of 6 points of pump. So if we draw something like a Vines of Vastwood, that would not necessarily do it, but Become Immense definitely would. Might of Old Croza definitely would. And it may be that we shouldn't have played the Inkmoth Nexus just because of the potential of drawing Vines of Vastwood. So if we had 3 green sources in play, we could kill our opponent with the Vines. But at the same time, I think that we've still got time, and we may want this Inkmoth Nexus to be able to deal our opponent essentially just 3 poison this turn. And okay, so it looks like our opponent is actually going to point a Lightning Bolt at our Blighted Agent, and so now we have a big decision to make. So we can fire off these mutagenic growths to both of them. We're going to have to use both of them in order to save the Blighted Agent, or we can just let it die and plan on winning with Inkmoth Nexus. So it's a pretty close decision for sure. So if we do let it die, we can animate the Inkmoth Nexus, get in for 2 points of poison, and then next turn animate the Inkmoth Nexus again. But if we have the Blighted Agent in play, that's going to be more poison damage over in the long run. So it's definitely a close spot. I think we want to just let our Blighted Agent die here. and go on the Inkmoth Nexus plan and save our mutagenic growths. So let's see how this goes. So Blighted Agent is gone. We're going to save the double mutagenic growths. Our opponents basically doesn't have a way to deal with our Inkmoth Nexus, which is why I like keeping it around. And we still can just draw a pump spell, and that should be good enough. Whereas if we fire the double mutagenic growth, it's possible that if we draw one pump spell, it wouldn't be good enough. And okay, so there's a Gitaxian. So we're going to fire off the Gitaxian probe here. Just paying the life, because we're not really that in danger of dying besides to a Primeval Titan or a Scapeshift. And we just want an additional card in our hand. We're basically any pump spell should give us the win on our next turn, and we see double Scapeshift. So our opponent's hand isn't great, but our draws have been pretty bad as well. So just going to go ahead, animate the Inkmoth Nexus, and then pump it up with our Pendelhaven. Now the interesting thing is that because our opponent does have this Courser of Kruphix in play, it's going to make it more likely that our opponent's going to be able to get to 7 mana as fast as next turn. So we may just need to top deck the pump spell on our next draw step. Because what our opponent can do is just simply play the Sakura and find a land off the top of their deck, and so that land has already been found. So this Sakura is going to be able to sacrifice itself for a mountain, and the Scapeshift is incoming, basically. So we're basically on a 1-turn clock. We need to draw any pump spell in our deck is actually going to get it done. Even a mutagenic growth would be enough. So our draw step was unfortunately Blighted Agent. So we had a bunch of draws to get there. We just kind of didn't. If we had kept the Blighted Agent earlier, that would not have helped us. I actually like the line we took. I think it was the best line, but we've left ourselves dead here to the Scapeshift in our opponent's hand. So expect to see that Scapeshift cast right here. So our opponents play that 7th land that we knew about, and yep, the Scapeshift is going to find a bunch of mountains, and we will see Valakut and basically 6 mountains come into play off the Scapeshift, and that is what happens. So we see a bunch of Valakut triggers, and that's going to do it for the first game. We were definitely favored to win that one. We just kind of bricked out super hard, drew a bunch of Gitaxian probes, not enough actual gas. So, doesn't happen that often, but definitely can. So, we're on to the sideboard plan. Plan B, essentially. So, looking at our sideboard cards, we don't want Kitchen Finks. We don't want Viridian Corruptor. Wild Defiance is a card we could consider bringing in, but I don't think we necessarily want it here. Dismember, we're actually going to board out our Dismember. We're going to board out our Dismember and Twisted Images, so it's possible that we do want the Wild Defiance as just a way to combat Lightning Bolt to a certain extent, but also just creates another pump spell. Spell Pierce is okay against this deck, but I think we're just trying to goldfish our opponent as fast as possible. So maybe we do want a Wild Defiance. And besides that, we've got one Spell Pierce in the main. Spell Pierce is okay. It can counter stuff like Explore early. It's definitely better than Dispel, I think. But fine with just having the second Wild Defiance and then 2 copies of Spell Pierce. That seems like it should be enough to get it done. And we also have this one Distortion Strike in the main. Yeah, I could see just boarding that out for a Spell Pierce. Alright, we'll see. Spell Pierce isn't great against this deck. Sometimes it won't do anything, but we are gonna have 3 in our deck, and our primary game plan should be good enough. So we're on the play. Double Noble Hierarch and a Blighted Agent. Not much else. Not really anything else besides lands. But I think we do keep this hand. The Dryad Arbor is also another card we could have considered boarding out, just because it's our direct damage is not really our plan here. It's to have a Blighted Agent or a Inkmoth Nexus and then win that way. But this hand is fine. We can go Noble Hierarch into Noble Hierarch Blighted Agent. And another reason why we do want Spell Pierce in our deck is because our opponent likely has Anger of the Gods. So we wouldn't actually mind drawing Spell Pierce as a way to protect ourselves from Anger of the Gods. So we're just going to go ahead and lead things off here. Basically, the way this matchup plays out a lot of the times is that Infect is ahead. Most of our good draws should be enough, but if we have a bad draw, like the last game, our opponent does have a reasonable clock, so we have to be aware of that. And since we don't have any real protection against Lightning Bolt, there's no reason to leave mana up. We are just going to hope that our opponent does not kill our Blighted Agent here. And if our Blighted Agent doesn't get killed, we're in a really nice spot. But it is going to die. So that's a bit unfortunate. We could have actually left Pendelhaven up. So that may have been the correct choice, thinking back on it. But now we're kind of in a situation where we're not really where we want to be, but we're going to try to get some direct damage, and our opponent looks to be a little bit mana screwed, so that could play out in our favor. And so, yeah, looking back on last turn, what we should have done was not play the Noble Hierarch and simply cast Blighted Agent, leaving Pendelhaven available. That way, if our opponent bolts, which ended up happening, we could have gone Mutagenic Growth, and then saved our Blighted Agent. But it looks like our opponent actually has an Engineered Explosives here. So that's going to take care of our Noble Hierarchs and just leave us with this Dryad Arbor. So we do want to draw an Infect threat. There is one. So that was pretty fortunate that we were able to draw the Blighted Agent. So we're definitely going to cast that. And the question is, do we want to attack our opponent on the axis of regular damage? And I think I think we do want to leave our Pendelhaven up like we should have done previously. And that way, if our opponent has something like an Anger of the Gods or a Bolt, we can respond, activate Pendelhaven on Glistener Elf, and then use Mutagenic Growth. And yeah, no real reason not to sacrifice our fetch land here. Wow, our draw was actually Vines of Vastwood. So that's a pretty good card to draw. That's potentially going to mean we can just go for lethal here. So let's start with the Might of Old Kroza. If our opponent had targeted it, then we could have gone for Vines of Vastwood. But now we can just go ahead and cast the Mutagenic Growth. And we'll finish things off by casting Vines of Vastwood with Kicker, and that should do it here for game 2. And it looks like our opponent just didn't find any green mana, so that was a little bit unfortunate. We probably could have positioned ourselves a little better that game, but in any case, it worked out, so it's all good. Now we want to consider what to do for game 3. So I don't think we really want any of these cards in our sideboard that much. Twisted Image would basically just be a cantrip. If our opponent happens to have Malira in their deck, then we would want Dismember, but we're just hoping that our opponent does not have Malira. And Wild Defiance is fine. It's almost a win more card, but I think we still want it. So let's just keep the same configuration. It worked out for game 2. Hopefully it works out for game 3. Alright, so this is a pretty interesting hand. I think we do want to keep it. We'll see how good this Spell Pierce actually ends up being. We've once again got our Dryad Arbor. It's once again a little bit awkward in this matchup. So I think we might want to just shock ourselves with the Breeding Pool rather than playing Inkmoth Nexus. And that way we can Spell Pierce one of our opponent's plays if we want to. And that makes sense, because we're kind of just trying to get cards in our yard, so we want to be able to use the Spell Pierce profitably. Unfortunately, our opponent does have Spellskite here, so that is going to be a problem. Just like Malira would have been, Spellskite is a big issue for our deck. Very hard to effectively answer it, because we've got a bunch of pump spells, essentially, but we don't have a real way to answer the Spellskite, and our opponent can pay life in order to redirect basically all of our pump spells. So yeah, that's a really frustrating card to see, and it makes it pretty unlikely that we're going to be able to win this game. Although it looks like our opponent's missing a land drop here. That's interesting. So we can go ahead and fire up this Inkmoth Nexus and start trying to make some headway on our opponent's life total. We're going to definitely want to Spell Pierce the Lightning Bolt. And Spellskite is the type of card where it's like, do we want Dismember against green-red Scapeshift? No, we really don't want it. But Spellskite is one of those cards where it's like, yeah, maybe we should have had Twisted Image in our deck, or had Spellskite in our deck. But hindsight's sometimes 20/20. We didn't see Spellskite in game 2, and it's not like we can't possibly win through a Spellskite. So what we can do is we can potentially win by using Vines of Vastwood to pump up our Inkmoth, and then, or pump up our opponent's Spellskite rather. So that's one line we can take, is to use our opponent's Vines of Vastwood so that the Spellskite can't be targeted by our spells. So if we were to, say, cast the Vines of Vastwood here, it wouldn't be good enough. So we have to wait maybe a turn or two in order to be able to make that play and have it be a winning line. Unfortunately, here is a copy of Reality Hemorrhage. So that's gonna essentially force our hand. So what we can do is we can go ahead and use the Vines on our opponent's Spellskite here. And then we can fire off the Mutagenic Growth. Reality Hemorrhage is a really weird card to be seeing out of this deck. So I'm pretty surprised that that is getting cast. But what we're going to do is we're going to fire off the Mutagenic Growth here. And our opponent is now unable to redirect these spells to the Spellskite. So now our Inkmoth Nexus is a 5/5, so our opponent's now at 6 Infect. And if this Dryad Arbor was able to tap for mana this turn, we would be in a much better shape. Much better shape, because we could also then play. We could have potentially even won that turn, but as it was, that Reality Hemorrhage definitely slowed us down quite a bit, and we're essentially back to the drawing board, just attempting to get through enough damage with our Inkmoth Nexus. Now we do have Spell Pierce, so if our opponent has another card they can point at the Inkmoth Nexus, we can counter it. And wow, so it looks like our opponent was fully prepared for Infect, because here is a copy of Sudden Shock, which clearly we can't do anything about that Sudden Shock. So our opponent's got not only Lightning Bolt, which is to be expected, but also Spellskite, great against us, and then also Reality Hemorrhage, which is fine against us. It's another removal spell, but then the Sudden Shock, it's like, really? Do you need all of that stuff just to try to beat Infect? Not so sure, but in any case, it's working out for our opponent. If we had an answer to Spellskite, we would definitely be in a better spot, but it's kind of unclear if that would even have been enough, considering the amount of removal our opponents had. What we're really looking for is another Infect threat, like another Inkmoth Nexus would be nice. But our opponent does still have 5 cards in hand. That's a lot of cards. So we're just going to go ahead and counter this Search for Tomorrow, just because the Spell Pierce may not do anything as the game progresses. And we can make an attack with the Dryad Arbor, but unfortunately, it's really not going to get us anywhere. So, I'm just going to go ahead and pass. And game 1, you saw how we actually didn't draw enough pump. So sometimes that can happen as you don't draw enough pump spells. It's just we've drawn way too many pump spells here, and we wish we had more basically sideboard tech for this matchup. And our opponent's getting to the point now where with the Sakura, our opponent's going to start to get Valakut online, and at that point, we may just not be able to do anything at all. And we also saw engineered explosives out of the sideboard, so just thinking about what our opponent could have in the sideboard, it looks like almost all of the cards are coming in this exact matchup, so that's pretty unfortunate. But that happens. You have to be prepared for anything. It's not like these cards are totally uncommon. The Spellskite has been very good here, and that's a pretty typical card to see. So if we were to draw another Vines of Vastwood, that would be nice because we could target our opponent's Spellskite with the Vines. Unfortunately, though, we kind of had to spend the Vines the turn that we did use it. And it may be that we shouldn't have even attacked that turn, just because we might have wanted to hold the Vines for the combo kill, but I really think we had to try to put pressure on our opponent. So, and also the fact that our opponent had Sudden Shock meant that even if we had waited to make that play, we still probably would have been blown out by the Sudden Shock our opponent ended up having. Alright, so it looks like our opponent now has access to Primeval Titan. So I'm expecting to see the Titan come down this turn, at which point we basically can't win. So yeah, our opponent's going to get 2 mountains, 4 Valakut triggers here, and that should put a cap on the game. Although, sorry, it looks like our opponent only has 5 mountains, but even so, the Primeval Titan's going to be able to attack next turn. We'll take a draw step. It's mutagenic growth, so yep, that's going to do it. Just going to go ahead and concede.